My name is Cam Alexis from the Tribal Chiefs Ventures Inc., situated in Treaty 6 territory in Alberta. I'm a board member of AAIC, Alberta Indian Investment Corporation. I'm also a former chief, former Grand Chief, and former regional chief of the AFN.
Thanks for taking the time to speak with us, Cameron. Let's start with your assessment of how Canadian governments have rolled out emergency measures to support the Indigenous economy through COVID-19.
Businesses are suffering a little bit, there's no doubt, because of the downturn. But I also believe the federal government needs to, and they have provided additional funding for Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurs and AFIs, for example. However, I don't feel it has gone far enough. It's not far-reaching enough. And my point is, for example, the $40,000 assistance fund is not enough, especially for struggling Indigenous entrepreneurs. Some have, sadly have closed their doors because of the business has not flourished in times of a pandemic. And the Alberta government here, for example, has a $1 billion fund that they are working with Indigenous businesses. It is a guaranteed fund, a loan fund. I applaud them for it. However, my position is, as a lead for a tribal council representing 6 nations, is that $1 billion is not enough, because we are sharing that with our brothers and sisters, the Métis nations of Alberta, the Métis settlements, and other Indigenous organizations and institutions, as well as the treaty people of Alberta. So when you equate that, $1 billion does not go far enough.
So what are the priorities in terms of supporting the Indigenous economy going forward?
The systematic approach of Indigenous funding was already relatively low. And I'll use an example of NACA, for example. My understanding is that the funding was reduced vastly throughout the past decade, and we've never gone back to that level. And we were working very hard, the board members and I, and the team, of course, to try and bring back those numbers that we've lost decades ago. And sadly, the COVID also hit, so it's a double whammy, so to speak. And yes, you are right. The funding was never sufficient to begin with. It was reduced and was never returned to sufficient levels. And we need to do that. But to do that, we need the government's help.
And what role do you see for the Aboriginal financial institutions, or AFIs, playing in supporting the Indigenous economy post-COVID-19, now that the government has committed more than $300 million to the Indigenous Community Support Fund?
I think the AFIs across the Turtle Island, if you will, coast to coast to coast, are doing absolute excellent jobs, if you will. They're doing very well, and this funding, the $308 million, should help them assist their past and current and perhaps future entrepreneurs. And the important thing here that I believe is, again, I alluded to earlier, the systematic approach of the $40,000 needs to be changed, in my view. We need to assist the entrepreneurs with more than that, dependent on the size of their loan or their company. That's something I would like to see. But at the same time, I think the AFIs themselves need assistance. They need help from those monies for their needs. For example, to keep the lights on, keep the doors open, and keep employing the staff for the AFIs. That needs to happen. And I really hope that after the COVID, which we don't know when that's ever going to be, so that the monies that were allocated stays with NACA and the AFIs, so they can at least, at a minimum, try to catch up where we had lost allocations years ago.
And how should systems within government bodies or crown corporations be improved in terms of actually getting money to the Indigenous entrepreneurs and companies that need it? What impact could this have?
In my view, I think it's keep it simple. I mean, make access to capital be a reality for the Indigenous people. In some instances, there's applications done and they're turned away, and for a multitude of reasons. And rather than do that, let's find a mechanism to prepare them for success. Successful application not only for the funding, but also successful application, if you will, success for their company to succeed. And that's some things I would like to see. Because, you look at municipalities, you look at provincial governments, they have contracts out there that they prescribe, for example. Or even at the federal level, contracts that are out there, for example, let's say with the military, or even with Indigenous Services Canada. If our Indigenous people have the capacity and the opportunity, they need to be provided the opportunity to perhaps garner or obtain those contracts so they can be successful. The way I look at it, if we have one successful Indigenous business who now hires other Albertans, other Canadians, it's not just hiring Indigenous people. I'll use the casino as an example, and some of the other companies that we have out there in the oil and gas sector. We hire qualified people. So in this business, we're in the business for not only the Indigenous people and the entrepreneurs, but for Canadians as a whole.
What benefits do intertribal associations provide in terms of economic development? And what types of Indigenous businesses do you see them investing in going forward?
The 634 nations across Canada, as well as the Inuit and the Métis nations, respectively, we need to work together, and we need to invest in one another. And when I was at the AFN, we even talked about setting up a hedge fund to pool our monies together and fund businesses that have a very strong business case, and that we see it's gonna be successful, and that they could draw from there. I know the government is looking at other avenues similar to that, but I think the AFIs and NACA have a role in all of this. I think the AFIs have done an excellent job with what little money they have received throughout the years. But if you increase their capital, increase their opportunities there, they can do a lot more. In other words, not only fund for minimum entrepreneurs, but we can now raise the bar in terms of, for example, funding someone who wants to, let's be upfront, buy a Tim Hortons for, say, $1 million. And First Nations out there actually do own Tim Hortons, by the way. And I'm very thankful and very happy to see when I travel Canada that Indigenous people are really stepping up to the plate and owning beautiful businesses. And we can't stop there. Here in Alberta, and I know for NACA example, I support agriculture. And I know we've been working on a possible mechanism to work with Agriculture Canada to step up a little bit and to support Indigenous ranchers and farmers as well. And because there is land out there, and we need to use that land to create employment for our people. And Agricultural Canada is well situated, so let's work with them to create space. Let's work with the logging industry, because the logging industry is still alive and well. Oil and gas has its challenges, but logging by far is fairly consistent. It all depends on the NAFTA agreement, of course, but it's fairly consistent. So let's look at new angles, such as the new age of computers and high-speed technology and everything else. And there is Indigenous groups out there looking at that. And at the same time, you touched on it earlier, Florent, and I touched on it as well, is we should never forget Mother Earth. If we can do environmental safe practices that will work, such as remediation of the earth and remediation of water, let's do it. Let's fund them. Let's support our entrepreneurs that are going that direction.
What progress is being made on upholding treaty rights, and what do we have to do or think differently in that respect?
Canadians need to understand and comprehend what is inherent rights and what is treaty rights. They need to understand that it's a time in our era that ignorance is not a solution anymore. Look at what happened with the Black Lives Matter. We support that. Indigenous lives matter. You know, the federal governments, through time, we introduced the United Nations UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. That still has not been embraced at the Parliament. Although one of our former colleagues introduced it in the House, it was defeated, sadly. In the provinces, some provinces have embraced it, others have not. Some municipalities have embraced it, such as the city of Edmonton, and others have not. That's an important sector. The education of treaty rights, inherent rights, has to happen all across the country. But the treaty rights has to be supported by successor governments. Not just the current government, not the past government, but the future government as well. And they need to start shaping what it is we want to do in this country to uphold treaty rights. And it's also to implement treaty rights. Because, I mean, sitting here right now, for example, I'll give you an example, Florent. You know, we get $5 a year just to say, hey, we're here, we still exist under the colonization approach. We get $5 just to say we're treaty Indians of this country. Well, that $5 a year with the cost of inflation should be worth at least $50,000 a year to our citizens, our people. Automatic. Inflation has not been put into play. The treaty rights need to be implemented. That's the biggest thing that needs to happen. If the treaty rights were implemented, and for example, if we were getting our share of the revenues in Alberta across Canada, the nations would be more than have ample funds to look after themselves. And we can manage our own destiny. And that has not happened.
And finally, if you had an opportunity to pitch a person or a group with the power to strengthen the Indigenous economy, who would you pitch and what would you say?
I would go to the Senate of Canada. The reason why I would go to the Senate of Canada is I've presented there several times. I've been privileged to do that. The Senate has a mechanism within the parliamentary process of Canada, and they have say. They can kill bills, they can kill financial institutions, etc., that are relevant for the cause of the Indigenous people of this country, and it has happened. I used UNDRIP, for example, and that's where it was defeated, for example. So the Senate of Canada needs to look beyond just political partisan approaches and support Indigenous people across this country, because if the entrepreneurs are successful, the businesses are successful, Canada as a whole succeeds as well.